Hello, my name is Nicole Allen, and I will be moderating today's media availability. I would like to begin by acknowledging I'm coming to you today from unceded Algonquin territory. A few points before we begin. This event will begin with a briefing from Bob Robichaud, Environment and Climate Change Canada Warning Preparedness Meteorologist. The presentation will occur first in English and be followed by a presentation in French. We will then move to a question period. Please note that this presentation is being live streamed on ECCC's Facebook and Twitter pages and will be available for replay. Between the English and French presentations, there will be a brief break to cut the live stream and reconnect to the French pages for the French presentation. Please do not disconnect from the Zoom call. After Bob's presentation is concluded, you will see the Government of Canada word mark. This will be followed by a 30 to 60-second pause to allow the live stream to disconnect. Please remain on the call. We will start the question period shortly after. In the interest of time, please keep it to one question and one follow-up. Bonjour, je m'appelle Nicole Allen et je serai la modératrice de la conférence de presse aujourd'hui. J'aimerais tout d'abord souligner que je me situe sur le territoire algonquin non cédé. Avant de commencer, j'aimerais soulever quelques points. Cet événement débutera par une présentation de Bob Robichaud, météorologue de sensibilisation aux alertes à Environnement et Changement climatique Canada. La présentation se fera d'abord en anglais et sera suivie d'une présentation en français. Nous passerons ensuite à une période de questions. Veuillez noter que la présentation est diffusée en direct sur les pages Facebook et Twitter de CCC et qu'elle pourra être réécoutée. Entre les présentations en anglais et en français, il y aura une brève pause pour couper la diffusion en direct et se reconnecter aux pages des médias sociaux français pour la présentation en français. Veuillez ne pas vous déconnecter de l'appel Zoom. Une fois la présentation de Bob est terminée, vous verrez apparaître le mot symbole du gouvernement du Canada. Une pause de 30 à 60 secondes suivra pour permettre à la diffusion en direct de se déconnecter. Veuillez rester en ligne. La période de questions débutera peu après. Enfin, veuillez vous limiter à une question et à une question de suivi. Veuillez vous patienter pendant que nous préparons la diffusion sur les médias sociaux. Please stand by as we go live on social media.
Bob, you may now start your presentation.
Good day, everyone. Welcome to this year's hurricane briefing as we start the 2024 hurricane season next week. The predictions from NOAA were released earlier this morning and are calling for an active season. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Next slide, please. So before I go into talking about this year's outlook, what I often like to do is look back at last year and see what happened in the previous hurricane season. If we look back a year ago, previous slide, please. No, go back to the second slide, please. Yeah. So looking at the predictions for last year, we were calling for 12 to 17 named storms, 5 to 9 hurricanes, and 1 to 4 major hurricanes. What I'll talk a little bit about in a minute here is some of the competing factors that we were looking at last year. Ultimately, what we ended up with was 20 named storms, 7 hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes. So certainly the numbers that we saw last year were a little bit, in terms of the named storms, were a little bit higher than the May predictions from last year. In terms of hurricanes and major hurricanes, it was right in that expected range from last year. So next slide. So looking at some of the storms that impacted Canadian territory, we had 5, maybe a 6th one that entered our Canadian Hurricane Center response zone. The most impactful storm last year for us here in Canada was definitely Lee, which caused a lot of damage, storm surge damage along the southern coast of Nova Scotia into New Brunswick as well, and quite a number of power outages. However, nowhere near the damage that what we saw with Fiona back in 2022. So next slide, please. So looking at conditions that what we were facing last year, and in last year's briefing, I did mention that we had two competing factors. One was the warm water that we were already observing in the Atlantic at this time last year. One of the things that was different last year is we were in a El Nino situation, El Nino condition, which is basically defined by warmer water in the equatorial region of the Pacific. And that tends to lower the number of hurricanes. However, the warmer water in the Atlantic tends to increase the number of hurricanes, named storms and hurricanes that we see over the course of a particular season. So we had these two competing factors, and going into the season, there was a lot of uncertainty in which factor would end up being the dominant one. And it turns out that the dominant feature from last year was that warm water, because we ended up getting those 20 named storms and a fair number of hurricanes and impactful hurricanes as well. So if you look at the Atlantic, again, last year, water temperature was certainly above normal. And then water temperatures were above normal in the Pacific. Now, next slide, I want to show the current water temperature anomalies right now in the Atlantic. So this is what everybody's talking about, is these very warm waters that we're seeing in the tropical Atlantic. And that is going to be a major contributor to this year's hurricane season. And we know that from last year, it was the warm water that ended up being the dominant factor. If we look in the Pacific, you can see that the water temperatures are actually getting colder, certainly colder than they were last year. So that is a condition called La Nina, which tends to favor hurricane formation in the Atlantic. So not only are we getting rid of that El Nino that we had last year, but the water temperatures are at record values in the tropical Atlantic right now. And that's why we're expecting a very active hurricane season this year. So next slide, please. So these are the numbers that were released by NOAA earlier this morning. As I mentioned, they're calling for 17 to 25 named storms, 8 to 13 of those would become hurricanes, and 4 to 7 of those would become major hurricanes. And you can see how that compares to the average. Very active season in the Atlantic expected this year. They always try to achieve a 70% confidence in their forecasts. This year, it's actually up to 85 that they've achieved with these numbers. So very, very high confidence level that it will be an active season this year. So next slide. So what does this mean for Canada? Well, the Canadian Hurricane Center has a response zone, and we don't issue necessarily bulletins and track forecasts and intensity forecasts on every storm that's out there. However, we do look at the ones that enter our response zone and issue special bulletins on those to provide information for Canadians on an approaching tropical cyclone. So this is our Canadian Hurricane Center response zone. So next slide. So if we look at the number of storms that enter our CHC response zone compared to the total number of storms in the basin, we typically get about 35% of those storms that form overall in the Atlantic come into our response zone. So if you kind of translate into those numbers that we saw earlier, again, looking at a potentially active season overall in the Atlantic. However, the percentage of those storms, although the average is 35, on any given year, that average can vary wildly. So even though We may be looking at an active season in the entire Atlantic. We just can't say where these storms are going to go at this stage prior to the season, and if any land areas are going to be impacted. So next slide. So again, hurricane season starts June 1st, extends all the way to the end of November. There have been storms in every month of the calendar year, so doesn't mean that if a storm forms outside the traditional hurricane season, that it's something, especially abnormal, because we have seen it before. But certainly the bulk of the activity occurs in the months of August, September, and October. So next slide, please. So finally, this is the names that we will be using this year. So there's already an area that is being watched right now in the Caribbean. There's a low probability of formation. However, if it does become a tropical cyclone, a named storm, or whenever the first named storm happens to be, whether it's this one or some other storm later on, it will be named Alberto and followed by Burl, Chris, and so on. So these are the list of names that we will be using this year. Given the predictions for the high number of storms, we may have to use our supplemental list of names. We no longer use the Greek alphabet, so we have a supplemental list of names that was introduced a few years ago after the 2020 season that we may have to use this year. So last slide. So finally, to get the most updated weather information, please download our WeatherCan app. All our CHC bulletins, track maps will be accessible on that particular app. Also, our Canadian Hurricane Center website. And finally, on tips on how to prepare, you can go to getprepared.ca. Thank you.
Please stand by while we prepare the French live stream.
Bonjour et bienvenue à la séance d'information sur la saison des ouragans 2024.
Sorry, Bob, we're not live yet. I'll just give you a cue again.
Okay.
Okay, you can go ahead, Bob.
Bonjour tout le monde, bienvenue à la session d'information sur la saison des ouragans 2024, les prévisions qui ont été émises par la NOAA aux États-Unis plus tôt ce matin. Donc, on prévoit une saison active. Donc, on va regarder un peu qu'est-ce qui s'est passé l'année passée et comparer ça à qu'est-ce qu'on voit pour cette année. Donc, la prochaine, s'il vous plaît. Donc, si on regarde qu'est-ce qui s'est passé l'année passée, à peu près au même temps l'année passée, quand les prévisions ont été émises, on parlait de 12 à 17 tempêtes nommées. De ceux-là, 5 à 9 étaient prévus de devenir des ouragans et 1 à 4 de ces ouragans-là étaient prévus de devenir des ouragans majeurs. Donc, du côté des ouragans et des ouragans majeurs, c'était en fait une assez bonne prévision. Malgré que le nombre de tempêtes on a vu 20 tempêtes nommées. Donc, on avait deux choses qu'on regardait de près l'année passée, qu'on va voir tout à l'heure. C'était une condition d'El Niño et aussi les températures de l'eau qui ont devenu très chaudes dans l'Atlantique. Donc, si on compare si on regarde les tempêtes de l'année passée, vraiment, c'est Lee qui a été la tempête la plus prononcée ici au Canada. On a aussi vu Idalia, qui était un ouragan majeur qui a frappé la Floride. Franklin était aussi une tempête qui s'était intensifiée très, très rapidement dans le milieu de l'Atlantique. Certainement plusieurs tempêtes l'année passée dans l'ensemble du bassin de l'Atlantique. Donc, la prochaine, s'il vous plaît. Donc, si on regarde les tempêtes qui nous ont affectés ici au Canada, soit sur nos régions terrestres ou sur l'océan, il y en avait 5, peut-être 6 tempêtes là, vraiment qui ont franchi notre zone d'intervention. Et comme je disais, c'était vraiment Lee qui était la tempête la plus importante pour nous l'année passée, avec des dégâts assez importants le long de la côte de la Nouvelle-Écosse et aussi du Nouveau-Brunswick à cause du nombre de tempêtes. Beaucoup de pannes de courant aussi qu'on a vu avec Lee. Donc, la prochaine, s'il vous plaît. Donc, si on regarde les conditions à peu près un an passé à ce temps-ci, ceci, c'est le 25 mai 2023. Qu'est-ce qu'on voyait? C'était les températures de l'eau dans l'Atlantique qui étaient déjà au-dessus de la normale. Les températures de l'eau se sont continuées à se réchauffer tout au cours de l'été. Donc, ça, on sait que c'est le carburant pour ces genres de tempêtes-là. Aussi, si on regarde du côté du Pacifique, on avait une région d'eau chaude le long de l'équateur dans le Pacifique. Ça, c'est une condition de El Niño. Quand on a une condition d'El Niño, on a tendance à avoir moins d'ouragans dans l'Atlantique à cause d'une augmentation de cisaillement des vents en altitude. Donc, on a fait ces deux facteurs-là qui compétitionnaient. On savait que les températures de l'eau étaient chaudes dans l'Atlantique, mais aussi on avait le El Niño. Donc, il y avait beaucoup d'incertitudes dans la prévision de l'année passée pour voir jusqu'à quel point ça allait être actif. Donc, si on regarde la même carte, mais aujourd'hui, si on peut passer à la prochaine, s'il vous plaît. Donc, si vous regardez de près les régions dans l'Atlantique, on voit les températures de l'eau sont beaucoup, beaucoup plus chaudes qu'elles étaient l'année passée à ce temps-ci. Qu'est-ce qui s'est passé? C'est que l'eau s'est réchauffée tout au cours de l'été passé. Et il y a quand même eu un refroidissement au cours d'hiver, comme qu'il y a à tous les hivers, mais on a commencé à un niveau qui était beaucoup plus haut vers la fin de la saison de l'année passée. Donc, les températures de l'eau dans les tropiques maintenant sont comparables à ce qu'on verrait dans le mois d'août. Donc, c'est assez exceptionnel. Du côté du Pacifique, si on regarde le rectangle dans le Pacifique, on voit qu'il y a eu un refroidissement de l'eau dans ces régions-là. Ça, c'est une condition qu'on appelle la Niña. Quand on a une condition la Niña, on a tendance à avoir plus d'ouragans dans l'océan Atlantique. Donc, ces deux facteurs-là, le facteur qu'on a la Niña qui se développe, et aussi qu'on a vraiment des températures records dans l'Atlantique, ça nous porte à croire que ça va être une saison active, même possiblement hyper active. Donc, si on peut passer à la prochaine, s'il vous plaît. Donc, si on regarde les prévisions, comme que je mentionnais tantôt, les prévisions qui ont été émises par la NOAA juste quelques heures passées, on parle de 17 à 25 tempêtes nommées. De ceux-là, 8 à 13 devraient venir des ouragans. Et de ces ouragans-là, de 4 à 7 pourraient devenir des ouragans majeurs. Habituellement, ils essaient d'avoir une confiance d'au moins 70% dans leurs prévisions. Donc, ils peuvent ajuster leurs chiffres en conséquence. Cette année, ils ont une confiance dans leurs prévisions de 85%. Donc, il y a beaucoup de confiance à cause de ces deux phénomènes-là qui contribuent à une saison active. Donc, la confiance est très haute dans leurs prévisions de cette année. Donc, la prochaine, s'il vous plaît. Dans notre zone d'intervention du Centre canadien de prévision des ouragans, vraiment, ces régions-là, on n'émet pas des bulletins sur toutes les tempêtes dans le bassin atlantique. Vraiment, qu'est-ce qu'on fait? On va émettre des prévisions de trajectoire et d'intensité de ces tempêtes-là quand on prévoit qu'ils vont entrer dans notre zone d'intervention. Donc, ceci, c'est notre zone d'intervention. Donc, si on regarde le nombre de tempêtes en moyenne qui franchit notre zone d'intervention à comparer à tout le bassin, on voit on a à peu près 35% du total des tempêtes qui se développent dans l'Atlantique vont se trouver dans notre zone d'intervention. Donc, la prochaine, s'il vous plaît. Donc, ça, c'est toutes les saisons au cours des années depuis 87, depuis la naissance du Centre canadien de prévision des ouragans. Et c'est ça, le pourcentage d'année en année peut varier énormément, mais en moyenne, c'est à peu près 35%. Donc, en 2020, c'était une saison record avec 30 tempêtes nommées. Et si on regarde, il y a vraiment 8 ou 9 tempêtes qui ont franchi notre zone d'intervention. Donc, ça peut varier d'année en année. Donc, la prochaine, s'il vous plaît. Donc, la saison débute la semaine prochaine, le 1er juin, puis il va se continuer jusqu'à la fin du mois de novembre, donc jusqu'au 30 novembre. Il y a eu des tempêtes vraiment dans tous les mois du calendrier, donc c'est possible qu'on ait une tempête ici qui se développe avant le début de la saison. Et c'est encore possible qu'il y ait des tempêtes au début décembre, ça c'est possible aussi, mais le gros de l'activité du côté des ouragans, c'est vraiment dans le mois d'août, septembre et octobre. Donc, la prochaine, s'il vous plaît. Donc, si on regarde les noms pour 2024, la première tempête va être nommée Alberto. Et la deuxième va être Burl, suivi de Chris, Debbie, et ainsi de suite. Donc, ça, c'est la liste qu'on va utiliser cette année. On a une liste supplémentaire qui a été conçue en 2021 après la saison de 2020, parce qu'il y a eu un peu de confusion sur l'utilisation de l'alphabet grec. Donc, on n'utilise plus ça. À l'heure actuelle, on utilise une liste de noms supplémentaires qui est la même liste à chaque année. On n'a jamais eu à utiliser cette liste, mais avec les chiffres qu'on prévoit cette année, c'est entièrement possible. On va être obligé d'utiliser cette liste. Donc, la prochaine, s'il vous plaît. Donc, finalement, pour avoir toute l'information sur n'importe quelle tempête qui approche nos régions, l'application MétéoCan, on a tous nos produits, nos cartes de trajectoire, nos bulletins d'information sont tous sur l'application MétéoCan. Vous pouvez aussi aller sur notre site web et finalement, pour mieux se préparer pour ces genres de tempêtes-là, vous pourrez aller à préparez-vous.gc.ca. Merci.
And your Zoom and your
Stand by. Please stand by while we disconnect the live stream.
So merci beaucoup. Thank you, Bob. We will now begin the question period with Bob Robichaud and Nathan Gillett, Environment and Climate Change Canada Research Scientist. Please note that this will be the primary opportunity for reporters to connect with ECCC experts on this topic today. To ask your question via Zoom, please use the hand raising function, or by phone, press *9 followed by *6 to unmute yourself. To be called upon, we ask that you make sure your name and your media outlet are clearly identified in your Zoom name. In the interest of time, please keep it to one question and one follow-up. Nous passerons maintenant à la période de questions avec Bob Robichaud et Nathan Gillett, chercheurs scientifiques à Environnement et Changement climatique Canada. Veuillez noter que ce sera la seule occasion pour les journalistes d'échanger sur ce sujet avec les experts de CCC aujourd'hui. Veuillez utiliser la fonction lever la main si vous avez une question ou sur votre téléphone, veuillez appuyer étoile 9 suivi par étoile 6 pour établir le son. Pour poser une question, nous vous demandons de vous assurer que votre nom et votre média soient clairement identifiés dans votre nom Zoom. Veuillez vous limiter à une question et à une question de suivi. So our first question is from Nathan Coleman from the Weather Network. Nathan? No? We'll move on.
Oh,
There's,
sorry, can you hear me now? Okay, there we go.
yes.
I just had the question of, with the outlook, does it look like many of these storms will be heading towards the Gulf of Mexico area or in towards the United States, or will they take a northerly track, or do we just have to wait and see?
Yeah, essentially, at this point in the season, it's really not possible to say, where exactly these storms are going to go. Just check and make sure I'm not on mute here. Okay. We can't really say where they're going to go. Really, we do have to wait till they actually form, because where these storms go really depends on the weather of the day. One of the things is the Bermuda High, how strong it is, where is it centered. That usually dictates if we see storms recurving, or if they keep going into the Gulf of Mexico or into Central America, as sometimes we see later in the season. So again, that's something that we can't really say with a whole lot of confidence at this point before the season starts.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Do you have a follow-up, Nathan?
Yes, just wondering if you could explain again, like, does it look like there will be less wind shear this upcoming season?
Yeah, typically in an El Nino, in a La Nina season, there tends to be less wind shear. Now, last year we had a moderate to strong El Nino, which tends to result in more wind shear. And certainly there was some in the Western Caribbean and in the Gulf of Mexico. And if you look at the map for the entire basin, you can see that area has a lot fewer storms than in, say, the central part of the Atlantic. But overall, the shear was definitely lower than what one would expect in the El Nino season. So now that we're going into a La Nina season, we expect even less wind shear, and that coupled with the even warmer waters compared to last year is giving us very high confidence that we are going to see more storms, at least than what we saw last year.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yep.
Our next question is from CBC Radio Ottawa. Would it be possible to clarify your name before asking your question? We'll just need to unmute them. Would it be possible to unmute CBC Radio? Okay, we'll move on to the next question from Keith Doucette, the Canadian Press.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi, Bob. I'm just wondering if you could talk about people are going to see the NOAA forecast, and often what you say is maybe interpreted as a bit played down because we are further north, obviously. But I'm just wondering, when they say there's a very busy season, what in general that means for the Canadian response area, given that, in a season where it's not so busy, all it takes is one, terrible storm to hit us and, we're hit. And whereas some years where it's busy, many storms stay offshore. Can you kind of put it in context for us better, given the latest forecast from NOAA?
Yeah, and actually, you just summed it up very well there. There are, like I was saying during the presentation, the percentage of storms overall that make it into our response zone varies tremendously from year to year. So depending on, even if we have, have been seasons that have been quite active overall in the entire basin, that if you look at the impacts or even the storms entering our response zone here in Canada, it hasn't been that bad. In other years where, for example, 2010, 2010 was an active season. There were no storms that affected the U.S. However, we had two landfalling hurricanes in the same year, in Earl and Igor. So that's what we can't really say at this point in the season is where these storms are going to go. So we are able to predict the overall activity in the basin, but where they will go, which areas might be affected more than others, is something that is impossible really to say with any really reasonable degree of confidence. So what we just have to do is keep monitoring what's going on in the tropics, and when these storms develop, pay close attention to their evolution and their predictions over the course of the coming days, because every storm, where it goes and how it intensifies or how it weakens is dictated by the weather for that particular day or that stretch of days.
You have a follow-up, Keith?
Yeah, I wonder, given the conditions that we're forecasting, you can address the idea of intensity. Are we likely to have more intense storms this year?
Yeah, when we see warm water like we're seeing now, and I got to say the level of heat that's contained in the ocean right now is pretty much unprecedented. We can expect some of these storms to become major hurricanes, and like Noah was talking about this morning, I think is like 4 to 7 of those storms would reach major hurricane status. The other aspect of this is rapid intensification, and that's something that we've been, watching very closely over the last number of years. It's just how rapidly these storms go from a tropical storm to a major hurricane. If we look at Otis, for example, last year, which was granted in Pacific, it intensified 177 kilometers per hour in a 24-hour period. So it went from basically a tropical storm to a major hurricane within a day. And we saw similar things with Franklin, although Franklin stayed just offshore. So that we were thankful for that. But when we see water temperatures this warm, you're looking at intensity and you're looking at the rate of intensification, which can be tremendous as well.
Thank you.
Notre prochaine question nous provient de Annie Guillemette, 98.5 Montréal.
Vous m'entendez bien?
Oui.
Super. Je vais faire faire le perroquet. Je ne m'y connais pas du tout en météo, mais pouvez-vous revenir en français sur la différence des années El Niño puis des années de la Niña, juste pour voir l'importance des facteurs pour cette année?
Oui, donc quand on a un El Niño, ça c'est une condition d'eau chaude dans les régions équatoriales du Pacifique. Ça a tendance à nous donner plus de cisaillement de vent dans l'Atlantique. Donc, il y a une plus grosse différence de vent en altitude d'une saison de El Niño à comparer une saison de La Niña. Les ouragans, ils n'aiment pas vraiment le cisaillement des vents. Vraiment, les ouragans sont des tempêtes vraiment verticales. Aussitôt qu'il y a beaucoup de différence avec la vitesse et même la direction des vents en altitude, on a tendance à avoir moins d'ouragans. Donc, l'année passée, c'était une saison El Niño. Cette année, c'est une saison, on se dirige rapidement vers une saison La Niña, qui veut dire qu'il y a moins de cisaillement. Donc, les vents sont plus uniformes dans l'Atlantique, qui fait en sorte que c'est plus propice pour ces genres de tempêtes-là à se développer. Donc, on a tendance à avoir plus d'ouragans dans l'Atlantique dans une saison La Niña que El Niño.
Si on combine ça avec l'eau chaude, qui est particulièrement chaude cette année, j'imagine que, et là, je vous fais encore faire la réponse en français, ça va avoir un impact possible, en tout cas, sur la violence des tempêtes.
Oui, on parle si tu parles de l'intensité, oui, absolument. On prévoit, là, avec les prévisions qui ont été émises ce matin, là, on parle de 4 à 7 de ces ouragans-là qui vont possiblement devenir des ouragans majeurs. Donc, ça, c'est des vents très violents et très destructifs. Donc, il n'y a pas juste l'intensité de ces tempêtes-là, mais c'est le niveau, comment rapide que ces tempêtes-là peuvent aller d'une tempête tropicale à une tempête très, très importante, même dans l'espace de 24 heures.
So our next question is from Natasha Belowski from National Observer. Her headphones are not working, so I'll read out the question. Bob, as you explained earlier, there are many factors at play here, El Nino, El Niña, and overall water temperature. Can you please explain how climate change impacts hurricane season and the intensity and/or frequency of storms? So I think that's something Nathan can respond to.
Thank you for the question. So in terms of climate change impacts on hurricanes, we don't expect a big influence on the frequency, on the total number of hurricanes, of tropical storms. But we do expect that the most intense hurricanes will become more intense. That was a projection of the last IPCC report. At the same time, the rainfall associated with hurricanes is also projected to become more intense. And with sea level rise will exacerbate the impacts associated with storm surges. So we do expect climate change to worsen the impacts of hurricanes, particularly the rainfall effects and particularly the storm surge impacts.
And then as a follow-up, we had mentioned you had called the current water temperatures unprecedented and described the process of rapid intensification. How concerned are you by both the water temperatures and storm behavior?
Certainly, if we look at conditions down in the tropics right now, the water temperatures are extremely warm. And we definitely expect that that area is going to be active. How that translates into what happens here in Canada is a different story. Now, if we look at general water temperatures off our coast right now, they're actually a little cooler than the average. That cold anomaly is expected to disappear by the time we reach the peak of hurricane season. But certainly for folks living down in the southern latitudes, it's especially concerning, but also concerning for us as well, because we can get some of these storms that recurve up towards Canada and can be quite intense as they sometimes transition to what we call a post-tropical storm, which can be quite intense as well. So definitely when we're looking at some of the conditions that govern the frequency and intensity of these storms, like La Nina and the water temperatures, when we're seeing everything line up the way it is, it certainly causes some concern, but the key to counteract that is the preparedness piece. And that's why we're talking about hurricanes today. Is one of the big reasons is just to remind people that we are approaching hurricane season. And if there's anything that needs to be done in preparation for that around your property, around your home, now is not a bad time to do it.
Our next question is from Paul Hollingsworth, CTV News. His name on Zoom is Zoom user. Thanks.
Hey there, can you hear me okay?
I can, Paul.
Hey, Bob. You can call me Paul, not Zoom user. I don't know what hurricanes. Listen, Bob, I have a follow-up. This is not the most forensic question I have. Just because I'm doing a TV story, your opening statement, you were covered by graphics. Can I get you on the screen in just like 20 or 30 seconds, just a summation of what the top headline of this is heading into hurricane season for you today with this announcement?
Okay, I assume you're seeing me in the full screen is at this point.
We're good now. We're good now. Thank you.
Okay. So the factors that go into predicting hurricane season are all lining up this year. We have we're transitioning from an El Nino that tends to lower the number of storms in the Atlantic. We're transitioning from that into a La Nina, which tends to cause more storms in the Atlantic. However, we're also looking at record water temperatures in the Atlantic. As of now, the temperatures are more kind of what we see in, say, August than they would be in May. So the combination of record water temperatures in the Atlantic and a developing La Nina is really lining up to be an active season in the Atlantic.
And thank you for that, Bob. As a follow-up, look, as a TV reporter, I've stood outside in many a hurricane and tropical storm over the past 10 years. My experience is this: we call it hurricane, and then at some point, the name changes to post-tropical storm, and the public, based on my experience, has the misperception that that storm is somewhat less dangerous or impactful, but yet post-tropical storms still take the roofs off of houses and cause flooding and massive destruction. Can you speak to the nomenclature there? Because my experience, especially during Fiona, was people thought changing the terminology to post-tropical was somehow downgrading the impact when in fact it wasn't.
Yeah, these storms, whether they're hurricanes, what we call them hurricanes or post-tropical storms, they are multi-hazard storms. And again, and I've heard this a lot, that there's certainly some truth to what you're saying in terms of the nomenclature. And one of the things I've heard is that, okay, well, post implies that it is over with, it's an after the fact storm. Really what it means is that a hurricane, a pure tropical cyclone, takes its energy from the warm water in the ocean. Post-tropical means that it has lost some of its tropical characteristics, but its intensity is no longer governed by the warm water. However, it's governed by differences in air temperature between north and south. It's largely a meteorological thing. In terms of Fiona, I've heard people say, well, you guys called it a post-tropical storm, and that's what led people to get their guards down. However, it was only declared post-tropical in the overnight hours of that Friday into Saturday. So going into Friday night, when all preparations should have been completed, it was still a hurricane at that particular time, which tells me that people aren't really paying as close attention as they could to the individual hazards that are associated with these storms. Whether it's a hurricane or a post-tropical storm, we're going to have storm surge. We're going to have heavy rains. We're going to have strong winds. And the nomenclature from the hurricane to post-tropical has no bearing on the intensity of the storm. It's just what actually fuels the storm.
Notre prochaine question nous provient de Monsieur Lawani, Radio-Canada Acadie. Est-ce que vous avez une question? Non, on va passer à la prochaine question. On a une deuxième question dans le chat en français de Radio-Canada. Donc, pour Monsieur Robichaud, dans quelle mesure les Canadiens pourraient être touchés par ces éventuelles tempêtes?
Ben, c'est certain, quand on prévoit une saison active, il y a toujours une possibilité que ces tempêtes-là nous affectent, mais qu'est-ce qu'on suggère, nous, c'est de se préparer vraiment de la même façon à chaque année. peu importe le nombre de tempêtes prévues. Donc, c'est pas vraiment qu'on se prépare pour une saison de 17 à 25 tempêtes. On se prépare pour la une ou deux tempêtes qui pourraient nous affecter au cours de la saison. Donc, c'est ça vraiment qu'il faut se préparer pour, pas nécessairement le fait qu'il va y avoir beaucoup de tempêtes dans l'ensemble du bassin atlantique.
Donc, on va reprendre la question de M. Lawani à Radio-Canada Acadie.
Allô, vous m'entendez?
Oui.
Merci de prendre ma question. J'aimerais savoir, quand vous parlez de 4 à 7 ouragans majeurs qui pourraient frapper une prévision, est-ce que c'est pour le Canada Atlantique ou bien c'est pour tout le pays? Et puis, à quoi devra-t-on s'attendre? Est-ce qu'on devrait voir un ouragan à la dimension de Fiona parmi ces 4 à 7 ouragans majeurs?
Oui. Si on regarde Fiona, dans le temps que c'était un ouragan juste au nord des Caraïbes, c'était évidemment un ouragan majeur qui est devenu une tempête post-tropicale par la suite. Mais comme je disais tantôt en anglais, c'est une tempête post-tropicale, ça ne nous dit rien sur l'intensité de la tempête. Ça nous dit juste le mécanisme d'intensité d'une tempête. Donc, si on entend le mot post-tropical, ça ne veut pas nécessairement dire que ça va être une tempête plus faible. Du côté des prévisions de 4 à 7 tempêtes, ouragans majeurs, il n'y a jamais eu un ouragan de catégorie 3, 4 ou 5, qui est un ouragan majeur qui a frappé les régions terrestres au Canada. Il y a eu des tempêtes, des ouragans majeurs qui ont entré dans notre zone d'intervention, évidemment, parce que ça s'étend plus au sud, mais il n'y a jamais eu une tempête purement tropicale qui a frappé le Canada comme catégorie 3, 4 ou 5. Il y a quelques tempêtes qui ont passé proche, mais il n'y a pas eu. Donc, les températures de l'eau, malgré qu'elles sont très chaudes dans le sud, dans les régions tropicales, les températures de l'eau dans les régions côtières du Canada ne sont pas assez chaudes pour soutenir des tempêtes de cette intensité-là.
Est-ce que vous avez une question de suivi? No. Okay, perfect. So our next question is from Sean Preble, Global News.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Sorry. Unmuting issues on my part. Glad you can hear me. Thanks again for doing this, Bob. I guess just my first question is, NOAA is saying this is the highest number of named storms, hurricanes, major hurricanes it's ever had for their May forecast. Though obviously, as you've said, you can't necessarily predict how many storms other than the 35% may enter the Canada zone. I'm still curious, does this statement about it being the highest have concern for you? And I will have a follow-up after you finish.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's certainly concern overall with storms in the basin, whether they affect Canada or they affect our neighbors to the south, either in the US or in the Caribbean. These predictions, there are several agencies that do predict hurricane activity in the Atlantic. Colorado State is probably the group that's been doing it the longest. They're really the pioneers in seasonal forecasts. And they actually come out with a prediction in April, and then they updated within the first couple of days of hurricane season. So they will be coming up with their outlook, their updated outlook here within the next week or two. In their April outlook, it was also their highest numbers that they had ever predicted for a hurricane season in that April outlook. So we'll see what happens here in a couple of weeks with their update. As far as NOAA goes, yeah, it's their highest that they've ever issued for for a May forecast. They haven't been doing it quite as long as Colorado State. But whenever you see those sorts of water temperatures and the fact that it's lining up with a La Nina, we were expecting some large numbers. And the question is that we can answer is where these storms are going to go. So we know there's probably going to be a lot, and there are probably going to be some really intense storms. The question is, where are they going to go? And we have to wait till they actually develop to get a good handle on that.
Okay, thank you for that. And it's funny you mentioned Colorado State. I did a story when that forecast came out, so it's so funny you mentioned that. My follow-up really is there is a lot of talk of preparedness. Noah mentioned it. It kind of seemed like every other word, and you yourself has also mentioned it. But I am curious, what can Canadians do, really just to prepare? Are there certain things, and this question is for either of you, really, whoever wants to answer.
Yeah, I can take a stab at it. Really, it starts with knowing your risks. So preparedness is going to take different shapes depending on the individuals involved, the families involved, the location. Obviously, someone who lives right on the coast is going to have to take certain precautions or preparations. That might be different from someone who lives inland at a higher elevation, because you can have different hazards from these storms causing different impacts. One of the things that, so in terms of the preparation, obviously, is knowing your risks. Once you, and that could be a matter of just sitting down and actually writing down what your risks are in your area. And Public Safety Canada has a really good website that walks you through this process. Once you know the risks, you can take measures to mitigate those risks, and then prepare with some of the items that you might need to have in the event of a power outage, or road closures, or those sorts of things. We often talk about trying to be prepared to be self-sustained for a period of 72 hours. Now, that is not to say that everything is going to return to normal in 72 hours. It just gives that period of time to allow emergency managers to come up with a plan to deal with whatever they're dealing with. So those are really the kinds of things that you have to start off with, is knowing what your risks are and then walking them or working through those risks to try and mitigate those risks, whatever they might be.
So our next question is from Matthew Degle, Telegraph Journal.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, so as you mentioned previously regarding the temperatures in the tropical Atlantic basin, also around Atlantic Canada, I guess what I was curious about is how about the potential impact of those water temperatures can have particularly in the Maritimes, in places like around the coast in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island.
Right. So yeah, as I mentioned earlier, so some of the there is a large area of water just off the coast of Atlantic Canada that's actually colder than average right now. And that's going to be something that we're watching over the course of the summer. Now, if we look at some of our longer term models, they suggest that this cold water, this cold anomaly in water temperature is going to disappear by the time we reach the peak of hurricane season, which is into August, September, and October. So that's going to be something that we're watching closely. So if we get to a point where the water off our coast becomes warmer than average, what happens is if we do have a tropical cyclone approaching, it kind of slows down the weakening that might otherwise occur if the waters were closer to normal or actually colder than average. If that area of colder water right now stays cold, that might actually increase the weakening of any pure tropical system that comes our way. The caveat to that is when we talked about post-tropical storms don't get their energy from the warm water. They get them from the difference in air temperature between north and south. like a Dorian, like a Fiona. So water temperature becomes less of an issue off our coast if a storm is post-tropical. If it's a pure tropical system like Juan in 2003, then water temperature plays a much larger role just off our coast.
And do you have a follow-up?
Yes. Basically, kind of just obviously, as you mentioned, we can only predict so much, at this particular point in time. I guess my follow-up question to ask, what should New Brunswickers, Nova Scotians, Prince Edward Islanders, folks from the Maritimes and Atlantic Canada should be preparing for, or certain expectations they should have, regarding this particular hurricane season?
Certainly. Well, if we do get one of these storms that approach us, like I said earlier, these storms have multiple hazards associated with them. People living along the coast are going to want to pay close attention to the track, because in some cases, depending on where this storm actually goes, it might actually push the water offshore, leading to lower water levels at the coast. However, on other areas of the coast, it could be a case where you have water piling up there and resulting in coastal flooding. So paying close attention to the track is really important. Wind, heavy rain are all hazards that are routinely associated with these types of storms. And we tell people every year, the old adage of turn around, don't drown. You don't drive or walk into flooded roadways or walkways. It's very surprising how strong that water can be. And sometimes it's too late. By the time you realize it, it can be too late, because there are lots of fatalities every year in Canada and in the US as a result of people venturing into flooded waters. So those are another area that we see a lot of people losing their lives is with the improper use of generators during power outages. Those are all things that to be very cognizant of if the power does go out, and if you are using a generator, to have it outdoors in a well ventilated area, far enough away from the house so as not to cause some issues there. And no matter what the situation is, whether it's a winter storm or hurricane, we tend to see problems arising from those things every year. So those are all things to keep in mind as we head into hurricane season 2024.
Our next question is from Mark Hodgins, City News.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
I can, Mark. How are you?
Hi, Bob. Good. How are you? So I guess I'm just wondering, it feels like over recent years, we've been seeing more storms, more tropical storm warnings and watches being issued here in Nova Scotia and Atlantic Canada. Are we seeing a trend of more storms impacting the region?
Like I said earlier in that graphic of showing the storms that enter our response zone, it varies widely from year to year as to how many storms enter our response zone. If we look at last year, for example, and one of the things that can be analyzed is the amount of time spent under the cone of uncertainty from a particular storm. And if we look at the entire season last year and compare land areas, you're right. Like Eastern Canada was the area that was under a cone of uncertainty for multiple storms the longest. So that was mainly made up of Lee and Philippe, where the cone extended into Western Nova Scotia and southwestern New Brunswick. But that's something we can analyze from year to year. And last year certainly was one of those years where we were under that cone of uncertainty quite actually more often than anywhere else.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Also, just as a follow-up, wondering if you could speak a little bit about how closely the Canadian Hurricane Center works with NOAA when it comes to tracking these storms. I do see that in the release today, NOAA's talking about it upgrading its observation systems this year. Do you think that'll be a benefit for you guys tracking any storms that come into your response zone?
Yeah, absolutely. We work closely with a variety of partners. As far as NOAA goes, we send some of our forecasters down every spring for some training, in-house training that they have down at the Hurricane Center in Miami. We're really first name basis with all the hurricane specialists down there. When we do have a storm that's expected to impact our territorial areas, we will have daily, usually even potentially multiple times a day, we will have a web meeting where we actually talk to some of the forecasters there. We provide our thinking, they provide their thinking, and then we come up to an agreement on where we think the storm is going to go, what areas need to be warned. All those things are discussed when a storm is approaching. And then we also collaborate during the off season to go through impacts that goes into their storm report. So we work quite closely with our partners at NOAA. But here at home, we also work very closely with our emergency management partners. I, for one, am embedded in the offices of EMO Nova Scotia. We also, I give a briefing to our emergency management partners at the provincial level all across Atlantic Canada before the season starts or right at the start of the season, which we're planning for this year again. So we work very closely with our partners at NOAA and also with our emergency managers here at home as well.
So our last question is from Dave Stewart, The Guardian. Dave, do you have a question for Bob? Just wait a few more seconds. Okay, so if you would like a PDF copy of the PowerPoint presentation, please send an email to media@ec.gc.ca. Si vous souhaitez obtenir une copie PDF de la présentation PowerPoint, veuillez envoyer un courriel à media@ec.gc.ca. This concludes today's media availability. Thank you. C'est ce qui conclut la conférence de presse. Merci beaucoup.